Today, the 9th of May, we celebrate Europe's Day. It's a special date. It's a date that marks the historic Schuman Declaration of 1950, when Robert Schuman laid the foundations for what would become one of the most extraordinary political and social projects in modern history, the European Union. A project born from the ashes of war, a project built on peace, solidarity, cooperation, and shared prosperity. A project that transformed a continent once defined by a division and conflict into a space of stability, democratic progress, and opportunity. But Europe Day is more than a commemoration. It's more than a celebration. It is a reminder, a powerful reminder that Europe's greatest achievements were never inevitable. They were built through political courage, through vision, through dialogue, through compromise, and through the understanding that common solutions are always stronger than fragmentation and narrow personal interests. In many respects, sport reflects the same European journey, a model that recognizes the specificity of sport and the autonomy of its representative structures. A model grounded in the principle of subsidiarity and in the recognition of the fundamental society role of sport. A model that understands that sport is not merely an economic activity, but a unique social, educational, and cultural force that must be protected and strengthened. Today, more than ever, these principles matter because the European project is not simply an institutional architecture of a single market. It's a community of values, values such as dignity, solidarity, inclusion, fairness, accountability, respect for the rule of law, and the protection of the common good. Sport must continue to embody and defend those same values. Ladies and gentlemen, as executive chairman of SIGA Europe, I want to reaffirm our unwavering support to the European sport model and for the principles that sustain it. A model built on solidarity, a model built on openness, on sporting merit, on social responsibility, on inclusion, and of course, on the understanding that sport serves a broader public interest. These principles are not abstract concepts. They create pathways for stable competitions, stable contractual relations between clubs, understood as the employers, and players. They sustain grassroots sports. They strengthen communities. They preserve social cohesion. And they ensure that sport remains connected to society rather than disconnected from it. Over the past 26 years, I have had the privilege and the responsibility of being deeply engaged in European sports policy with the institutions of the European Union, first as co-founder and elected CEO of the European Leagues, and co-founder and CEO of the World Leagues Association, and today as co-founder and global CEO of the Sport Integrity Global Alliance and executive chairman of SIGA Europe. And there is not the slightest doubt in my mind about the extraordinary trajectory of these two worlds, Europe and sport, worlds that once did not recognize each other, did not acknowledge each other, and had no dialogue and no cooperation. Two worlds that not so long ago barely speak with each other, but that today increasingly understand not only their respective roles, but their interdependence. Because Europe needs sport, as sport needs Europe. Europe needs sport because sport remains one of the most powerful social platforms, capable of promoting education, inclusion, well-being, identity, and democratic participation across generations and borders. And sport, obviously, needs Europe because only strong institutions, coherent legal frameworks, and principled public policy can help protect sport from the growing pressures that threaten its integrity, its credibility, and its sustainability. Self evidently, much has been achieved over the past decades. But let us not deceive ourselves. Much more remains to be done, particularly in the field of financial integrity. Indeed, at a time when sport, and the European football in particular, has become an increasingly attractive ecosystem for investment funds, opaque and less opaque ownership structures, offshore vehicles, speculative capital, and multi-club ownership models, it's inevitable that serious questions, sooner rather than later, arise. Questions about the integrity and transparency, questions about the oversight, questions about accountability, and ultimately, questions about who really owns, who really controls, and who really pulls the strings and influences part of our sporting ecosystem. Yet, despite the growing complexity and financialization of sport, public debate and institutional scrutiny have not always kept pace with the scale of these challenges. Too often, these issues remain confined to technical discussions, treated as peripheral concerns rather than strategic integrity risks capable of affecting, as they do, the credibility and independence of sport itself. Meanwhile, ownership structures become increasingly sophisticated. Regulatory frameworks, on the other hand, remain fragmented. Oversight mechanisms struggle to keep pace with the financial engineering and creativity. And the distinction between legitimate investment and systemic vulnerability becomes ever more difficult to discern. And yes, we have to acknowledge, we have to admit it, there is still far too much territorial defensiveness, institutional denial, and carefully orchestrated window dressing. Because apparently, in some quarters of sport, managing perception is still considered more important than confronting realities. This, ladies and gentlemen, is precisely why it is indispensable to pay close attention. I repeat, this is precisely why it is indispensable to pay close attention to the work being undertaken, or not, by the new anti-money laundering agency. Because the integrity of sport cannot coexist with opacity, and credibility cannot survive where scrutiny is absent. If we genuinely believe that sport deserves public trust, then sport must also be prepared to meet the standards of integrity, transparency, good governance, and financial accountability. This is what is expected from every other sector of strategic social and economic importance. Integrity, therefore, cannot stop at the edge of the pitch. But let me say this to conclude in the most unambiguous manner. That is not the only area where the European Union has underperformed. We have to be honest. Over the past quarter of century, then surely effective protection of sports intellectual property rights must rank near the very top of the list. For more than 25 years, many of us have engaged consistently with the European Commission, the European Parliament, and national governments to advocate and to convince them for what should have long ago been recognized as both necessary and urgent. I'm talking about meaningful legal protection against digital piracy and other forms of systematic cannibalization of sports audiovisual rights and intellectual property. Because let's be absolutely clear. For most sports organizations, media and intellectual property rights are not abstract commercial assets. They are the economic engine that sustains the entire sporting pyramid, the entire sporting ecosystem, from finance of grassroots development. They support youth academies. They sustain women's sport. They fund solidarity mechanisms between professional and non-professional sport. They create employment and wealth, and they enable sport to fulfill its social and educational mission. Yet, illegal streaming platforms are increasingly sophisticated and increasingly sophisticated forms of digital piracy continue to proliferate at industrial scale in the most blatant impunity, eroding revenues, weakening sustainability, and undermining the very foundations upon which the European sport model depends. And despite countless consultations, reports, declarations, and other initiatives, the gap between ambition and effective enforcement remains deeply concerning. Because this is not merely a commercial issue, it is a sustainability issue, it is an economic viability issue, a governance issue, if you wish, and ultimately a European issue. If the European institution genuinely recognize sport as a strategic social and economic sector, then, as they rightly and repeatedly proclaim, then protecting its primary revenue streams and ensuring its commercial viability cannot be treated as optional policy considerations. They are institutional responsibilities, indeclinable responsibilities. So, ladies and gentlemen, quite simply, a European sport model deprived of the ability to protect and monetize its intellectual property rights in the digital ecosystem becomes progressively weaker, more vulnerable, and ultimately less capable of fulfilling its social mission. And that should concern all of us. This is why SIGA Europe launched the SIGA of debates on the future of sport in Europe, bringing together European institutions, governments, sports governing bodies, athletes, experts, civil society, all engaged in a meaningful dialogue about the future direction of European sport. That is also why SIGA Europe has developed the Sport Transparency Index last year. Because the future of sport in Europe cannot be shaped solely by commercial considerations or competitive structures. It must be shaped by values, and it must continue to reflect the founding spirit of the European project itself: cooperation over fragmentation, responsibility over complacency, integrity over expediency, and long-term vision over short-term interests. Today, the 9th of May, as Europe celebrates Europe Day, we should remember that the European project was never simply about building institutions and creating bureaucrats. It was about building trust. And trust, ladies and gentlemen, whether in Europe or in sport, can only survive where there is integrity, accountability, but also courage. Thank you very much.